Welcome to my channel. Today, we're exploring Stellar Defiance, a sci-fi journey where humanity stands strong and defies the odds across the galaxy. Dive into epic starship battles, powerful tech, and the resilience that makes us unstoppable in a universe full of challenges. If you're ready for a thrill-packed adventure in deep space, hit subscribe, and let's get started. I work as a security guard at a secret government facility. The job was nothing special, really, or at least, that's what I thought when I first signed on. I didn't ask many questions during the hiring process, and honestly, I didn't expect much. A simple 9 to 5 gig, or rather, a 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, spent monitoring security cameras, walking the perimeter, and making sure no one wandered where they shouldn't. The paycheck was decent, and the work didn't seem too hard. How complicated could a government job like this be? The facility itself was located in a remote area, far from any city or town. There were no neighbors, no nearby buildings, nothing but thick forests surrounding it for miles. The kind of isolation that would make anyone uneasy, but I figured it was standard for a government site. The facility was large, sprawling across several hundred acres, and it was fenced in by tall, unscalable walls topped with barbed wire. It had the appearance of a typical research complex, with several main buildings that seemed functional enough, though not particularly glamorous. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find anything of interest unless you had clearance to be there. On my first day, they gave me a rundown of my duties. The guard before me handed over the keys to the control room and briefed me on the security system, which was vast and intricate. There were cameras everywhere, motion sensors, infrared devices, and access points that were meant to keep out anyone who wasn't supposed to be there. The entire setup was high-tech, way beyond what I had expected. But I shrugged it off. It was just another security job. What was strange was how little they told me about the facility's purpose. There were vague references to research, but that was it. I didn't ask further questions. Some things were better left unknown. The first few shifts were uneventful. The most I did was monitor the surveillance footage, walk the perimeter now and then, and ensure that the gates were locked. The quiet was deafening. The building was virtually deserted at night, and most of the activity seemed to happen during the day, which made sense. No one ever seemed to stay after hours. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It started with the humming sound. At first, it was almost imperceptible, like the soft vibration of some far-off machine. It was constant, and I had trouble pinpointing where it was coming from. The hum was low, almost a murmur, and would occasionally grow louder at certain times during the night. It was as if the entire facility was alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't quite understand. I remember the first time I really noticed it. I was walking down the long corridor between the guard shack and the maintenance building, and as I passed a large, nondescript structure, I felt the hum reverberate through my body. It made the air feel thicker, somehow. It was unsettling, and for a brief moment, I stood there in the dark, wondering if I should investigate it. But, of course, I didn't. I went on with my shift, chalking it up to the facility's equipment. Maybe the generators or some heavy machinery in one of the buildings was running at a low frequency. But I couldn't get the sound out of my head, and as the days passed, it became more pronounced. It wasn't just the hum anymore, it was the feeling that something was watching me. When I was out on my patrols, I could feel eyes on me from the windows of the buildings, or sometimes from the trees at the edge of the property. It wasn't a physical presence, but an uncomfortable sense of being observed. There were no other guards out on the compound at night, just me. So, I chalked it up to the natural isolation, the oddness of being in a place that had no real human presence around it. But even as I thought that, I couldn't quite convince myself. It was something else. It felt wrong. And then came the strange figures. It started as fleeting glimpses out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving between buildings or flitting across the far edges of the camera's view. I thought I might be imagining things. It wasn't uncommon to see movement in the periphery of your vision when you were tired. But when I started to see these figures more frequently, I grew concerned. Sometimes they were human-shaped, sometimes less so. Sometimes they stood still for long periods, and I would watch them, waiting for them to move until they did. But whenever I focused my gaze directly on them, they would vanish, or I would look away for just a second, and when I looked back, they were gone. No trace of their presence. I mentioned it to one of the more experienced guards during a shift change, but he just laughed it off. "You're just getting used to the place," he said. "This old facility messes with your head. You'll get used to it." He gave me a quick slap on the back and walked away, but I could tell by his uneasy expression that he wasn't as nonchalant as he pretended to be. That's when I started noticing the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, following me as I walked the perimeter. I would turn a corner and expect to see someone there, but no one was ever in sight. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. Sometimes it felt like there were 2 or 3 people trailing behind me, just out of sight. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, maybe the sound of my own boots echoing off the walls. But it was too consistent. Too deliberate. Still, I told myself it was probably nothing. The human mind, after all, is an amazing thing. We can convince ourselves of almost anything, given enough isolation and time. So, I pushed it all to the back of my mind. But then something changed. It was around 3 weeks into my shift when the real strangeness began. I was in the central monitoring room, sitting at the desk, watching the security feeds, when one of the cameras started to glitch. It was minor at first, just a flicker on the screen. I tapped a few buttons, expecting it to fix itself, but the feed didn't come back on. Instead, the screen filled with static, and then a face. It was fleeting, barely a second, but it was unmistakable. A distorted, ghostly face appeared in the static, its eyes wide and staring at the camera. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The face was unfamiliar, too stretched, too wrong. It sent a chill down my spine. I froze, staring at the screen. The face faded as quickly as it had appeared, and the static returned, but I could still see the outline of those wide, fearful eyes in my mind. I blinked and reset the system, but everything appeared to be fine. The security system was working normally, the cameras were operational, and there was no sign of malfunction. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe I was just tired and imagining things. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined that face. It had been real. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what it was. The days that followed were filled with more of the same. I would catch glimpses of figures out of the corner of my eye, strange noises would echo through the empty hallways, and I felt that sense of being watched, always just beyond my vision. But what bothered me the most were the sounds. There was a hum, always a hum, but sometimes, at the strangest hours, there would be voices. Muffled whispers, like distant conversations, but no one was ever around. The voices would stop if I tried to focus on them, but then they'd start up again once my attention shifted. I started to dread my shifts. The isolation was getting to me, and the unexplainable occurrences only seemed to grow. I would hear footsteps behind me when no one was there, doors would creak open in empty hallways, and the sense of dread grew with each passing night. But the worst was yet to come. One night, I found myself walking near the central building, one of the most heavily secured areas of the compound. There were always guards stationed around it during the day, but at night, it was off limits. No one was supposed to go near that building after hours. But some unseen force pulled me toward it. As I approached the building, I heard a faint sound, a whisper. It wasn't human, it was deep, guttural, almost animalistic. The voice seemed to come from the building itself, vibrating through the walls. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to go closer. That's when I saw the figure. It wasn't a guard, and it wasn't anyone I recognized. A tall figure, cloaked in black, stood at the entrance of the building, barely visible in the shadows. The figure didn't move at first, but then I saw its eyes. They were dark, unblinking, and filled with a strange, unsettling intelligence. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. But then the figure stepped forward, slowly, and disappeared into the building without a sound. I stood frozen for a few moments, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it one of the staff members, an experiment gone wrong, or something else entirely? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned and ran back to the security office, but as I passed by the restricted building once again, I saw something that stopped me cold. The doors were wide open. No alarms were sounding. No lights were flashing. Just an empty doorway, waiting for someone to step inside. Something told me I should stay away, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the door. But as I got closer, something inside me screamed to turn around. Every instinct in my body told me not to go inside, but I couldn't shake the pull. There were answers within those walls, I was certain of it, but I wasn't sure I was ready to find out what they were. That was the last night I worked there. I handed in my resignation the very next day, and I've never returned. I still don't know exactly what I experienced in that facility. The things I saw, the figures, the faces, the whispers haunt me every night. I still hear the hum sometimes, lingering in the back of my mind. And I still wonder if I was the only one who saw it all. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the mind? Or was there something truly sinister at work inside that government facility? I'll never know. But one thing is certain: I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. And I'll never forget the eyes that stared back at me from the static.